Before we start the second section tonight, I just want to take a moment to reflect, which seems very in the spirit of the evening tonight, celebrating volunteer work and celebrating the history of the HIV, not celebrating, but commemorating the impact of HIV and AIDS in Australia. I'd just like to take a moment to commemorate the life of Sister Margaret Mines, who left us this weekend. Sister Margaret Mines was an incredible part of the legacy of the work of HIV and volunteering and also faith-based responses to that, medical responses to that, and community responses to that. And I think it's with great sadness that as a community we grow and we reflect on the things that we have gained and the things that we are stronger for. We also know that continually we lose the people who were part of that legacy. And it's sad and devastating to lose those people, but it's incredibly lovely to be in a room of people tonight, many of whom would have worked with Sister Margaret and many of whom would have known or been affected by her work. So just to take a moment to reflect on the contribution that Sister Margaret made and reflect on the amazing legacy her life was and what she leaves behind. I think it's humbling to do that, and so thank you everyone for having that moment with me. And you can all find endless tributes to the work of the sister online. But I had a few that I would share, but I think actually it's best for you to think about that for yourself and find the one that means the most to you. We're going to continue now with the second part of the with the second part of the interview session. So I get a little bit more leeway in asking the questions that I wanted to come up with, and then we're going to throw to the audience, which is always very exciting and stressful for panelists. So I've already put them on their toes a few times. There's a list of questions. Some of the ones I asked before completely made up. I had no idea they were coming. So thank you for your flexibility around that. This section in the 10 minutes I have, I wanted to talk about the interview process. My first question is, to what extent does your subjectivity as interviewers and authors impact the interview process for a book like this, and also impact what was eventually included? I might start with you, Paul, doing the hot seat.
Oh, okay. Well, it certainly does. Any interview that gets produced, any transcript for an interview gets produced is a result of a conversation between two people. And it's a result of the questions that you ask as much as what is told to you. So you as an interviewer are shaping that interview. And then of course when you're writing out, you're interpreting, you're choosing what you think is most relevant and how to make sense of that. I think what's really interesting in this book is that we have three very different subjectivities and I suppose identities. I don't know if I'm allowed to reveal this, but we have a gay man, a straight guy, a lesbian as the three authors of the book. We're kind of from slightly different generations and we're from different parts of Australia. So our experience of living through the AIDS epidemic ourselves was very different. And I think we brought that to the interviews that we did. And I know, for example, I interviewed a guy who was a heterosexual man. He was an 80-year-old guy, grew up in a small country mining town in Western Australia. That was my background. So when he was telling me these things, and it subsequently turned out that he was gay, and that he'd hid it since he was all his life. In fact, I was one of the first persons that he told during the middle of the interview. Sorry to spoil the reveal in that chapter of the book. You won't now be as shocked as I was when that came through halfway through the interview. But I think he actually only felt comfortable to share that information because he knew who I was and that I would understand that background that he was from, and maybe he was speaking to a straight guy as well. And he might have not told that story, say, to Shirleene, or he might not have told it to Robert. So there's just an example, I suppose, of how your subjectivity shapes maybe what someone's willing to say, and might shape how, as I said, how you're going to interpret that information.
And I think for me, just to kind of expand on what Paul was saying, there's a chapter that I wrote about Bill Ruck, and who is this remarkable guy who was a actually the longest serving president of the Queensland AIDS Council. During the 1980s, and as people would probably know, Queensland was the second last mainland state to decriminalise homosexuality and had the Joh Bjelke-Petersen government in power during the 1980s. So it was a very hostile environment for homosexuality, and a state that had a very hostile response to HIV and AIDS. And I think that because I grew up in Queensland and was alive during the Joh Bjelke-Petersen years, I think there definitely was that shared understanding of what that Queensland was like. And I think there's a line that Bill says where, you know, if you killed someone for manslaughter, your jail sentence would have been less than if you had engaged in consensual homosexual activities with another guy. So that was the kind of Queensland that Bill talks about, and I think that he knew that I knew to some extent. I mean, I could never really fully know it, but I appreciated what Queensland had been like in that time period. So I think that, like Paul, I similarly have that experience of kind of knowing that world and being able to kind of understand that. So yeah, I think that if somebody who wasn't from Queensland had done that interview, it may have been very different. And for me, one of the greatest compliments that I kind of got by somebody else who'd read the book was, I didn't actually kind of know that about Bill, and for them to be able to read that book and kind of have his perspective come through was a real compliment for me.
I'll just say about the interviews, I think the oral history interview is like it's a deeply human kind of experience. In fact, I have at times thought that oral history interview is a little bit like a one-night stand. I really am the gay man of the authors. You kind of turn up on someone's doorstep and you're let in, and there's this kind of this opening, awkward kind of conversation. And then you can have like 3 hours. This is clearly a good one-night stand.
They're not always good. They don't always make you breakfast either.
You kind of get 3 hours of deeply intimate, kind of personal, and you can really immerse yourself in someone else's experience. And then it's kind of funny that the recorder goes off, and then the awkwardness kind of comes back, and it did kind of remind me of the morning after sometimes. You kind of get your stuff together, and it's like, yeah, cheers, thanks a lot, and you leave. But what I do think, what I find with these interviews is that people leave an imprint on you, even just for the 3 hours. You're left with kind of an imprint, and then if you do your job right, when you're writing the chapter, you kind of give a sense of what that imprint is.
I tell you what, sometimes as a moderator you just don't expect what's coming up. And Mask for Oral History is not what I expected to experience today. Robert, you talked earlier about, and it was a good comment you made about being the boss, the hierarchical nature of this. One of the things that means also is that you're essentially responsible for the ethics and care of the project. And I'm interested to know from an interviewer's perspective, how do you make sure that in such an intense process, the interviewers and researchers stay safe through what can be a pretty traumatic workload of doing these oral interviews? How do you look after yourself? How do you make sure you're okay at the end of all these intense, intimate one-night research stands?
Yes, leader. How did you protect us?
I set you up on that.
Right, so the truth is, I actually wasn't the leader on this grant. That is actually Shirleene was the first researcher on this one, and I just left the others to look after themselves, basically. But how do you look after yourself after an interview? Again, I think there's been a couple of interviews when you leave. It's not only the imprint, but it's kind of a sense of heaviness. You do sometimes get a sense of the grief that people felt. And then, I just kind of sit with it for a while. And because I have another life in which I've worked as a therapist, you're kind of used to it a little bit. But it's just kind of creating that time to digest it.
And in a sense, we're interviewing the survivors, and they've often got a good story to tell because they got out and made it out, I should say, and helped other people make it out. So it's often really, they're talking about very painful experiences, and you cry with them sometimes. But in the end, they've all got stories of hope in there, which is not always the case when you interview people for oral history projects.
I think that the question is a really great one, and I don't know that there are any easy answers to it, but I think that both Robert and Paul have put really important perspectives on it, but it's a really intimate exchange, and it depends a lot on the trust and the bravery of the people who do tell their stories, and I think we've all often asked ourselves whether we could do that, because it really is something to give up your time and to share what was a really difficult, emotional, often incredible, unexpected ways, but very emotionally rich part of your life, and to share that with somebody that is a stranger to you. So I think that we did all walk away from interviews kind of with that sense of privilege, that we were really lucky to hear what people chose to share with us, and that's definitely stayed with me. And I think that you don't walk out of the interview and just switch off, because sometimes you'll be with somebody for 5 hours, it could be longer, it could be a number of sessions, it might be 4 or 5 hours. And you do have that sense of a connection, so I think that connection does endure, and I think that one of the legacies of the project is that we walk away with a sense that we've been trusted with a remarkable history, and with people gifting us and sharing their stories, and they've done it for a purpose. I don't think, I know we all think that the people who told their stories are heroes, because they are, but none of those people shared their stories because they felt that they deserved any attention. They shared their stories because they felt they'd been part of a history that they wanted people to know about, and I think that we felt a real responsibility to share that with other people, and it never leaves you that what we have been given is a gift, and that still is with us today, I think.
That's so lovely, thank you. Look, as much as I'd like to be the boss of everything, it is now time to ask if there are any questions from the floor. So I believe I have Maria and Reg with some roving microphones. One of them might be mine, which is disappointing for me. I will hand it over, Maria. You can take this one. No, I'll just boss you around. Does anyone have any questions from the floor? We can start that here.
I was interested in how you actually found the people. What did you do to decide who you were going to interview?
I do remember that we kind of made people know about the project, and then we were very fortunate in that we did have a lot of people coming forward to share their stories, and I think that I do want to give due credit to organisations like ACON, because they did share information about the project to people as well, and so there were a lot of people who had volunteered for a very long time, or who were still connected to those kind of links. And also, as word got out, and as the queer press would do stories about it, more and more people came forward. So often word of mouth was really important. Somebody would speak to us and they would tell their friends that maybe they should share their story. So it kind of snowballed in a way. So there wasn't one clear way that people came to us, but it was really, interesting how people came from all different parts of Australia, and from different generations, and from different backgrounds as well. So we were really, really pleased with that.
Yeah, so the universities put out press releases, and I think went to the gay press in particular, but also mainstream press. I think we did some radio, and there was, I think Shirleene, you had that article in The Conversation, which is sort of a national sort of online newspaper. So that kick-started things, and then there was the snowball effect where people recommended us. And often when we interviewed people, we asked them, is there someone else you think we should talk to, or that you could ask them to get in contact with us, particularly if they might tell us something different and might even contradict what you say. We're always interested in that sort of diversity. Yeah.
We probably have one more after this, so it's going to go down there, and then that's our...
That's not enough.
Very
time.
Are you the MC tonight?
No, Brent.
Two more, okay. Apparently I'm not the MC either.
Hi, my name's Chad. I had a question around, of all the fantastic stories and interviews you had with people, how many of those perspectives and reflections, how many, if any, were of the bisexual or non-monosexual experience?
Of the people that I interviewed, I think 3 that I interviewed, and I interviewed about 20, maybe just less than 20, And yeah, there's one guy in the book, I suppose, although he's identified, he's married his whole life, he's identified as, well, as heterosexual. He himself, I suppose, privately identifies as gay. And that was his big interest in, I think, being a part of the AIDS Council and why he wanted to volunteer. In fact, why also his wife recommended he volunteer at the AIDS Council. It was sort of an unspoken thing, I think, between them. So that would, I suppose, be one person.
I'd probably have a similar ratio, I think, to Paul. Probably more noticeable with people who identified as men than women, but I'd say similar numbers.
Hi, sorry, I probably shouldn't ask a question because I'm a boring historian. Very historian question. You talked about gathering an archive, what we call an archive here. It's amazing repository of voices, and not all of them are in the book. I wondered if you could talk about what happens to the rest of them, and are they accessible, and how is that beautiful record you've created preserved for the future?
So in terms of the interviews, so there's a considerable body of information there, and I think that it's really important that they do be preserved because they are a remarkable source of information. So they're with the Australian Queer Archives, most of them. There's 8 that are with the National Library. But everybody who did the interview filled out a commission slip that kind of set out the conditions of access that they wanted to put into place. So we were really keen that those interviews be available, but we also wanted any kind of conditions that people wanted to put in place to be respected as well. So yeah, there are a huge number of interviews, but access will vary over time and depending on what people wanted to make it accessible.
Do we have one more question from the audience? Oh, Julie. We'll run it down.
My name is Julie Bates. I just want to say, first of all, thank you very, very much for bringing together the stories of these incredibly hard-working, dedicated people. And it's wonderful that it is documented for posterity. Paul Sendziuk, I remember, or you might remember, all those years ago, when you gave Shirleene Robinson the opportunity to finally have her voice and her say when people wanted to shut her down. But my question is, how did you define volunteer?
It's hard hitting for the end, isn't it?
That was going to be the Dorothy Dixon. Well, we actually had a really broad definition, and we actually spoke a lot about this. So, did activism count as volunteering? Going out in the streets or helping in some part of a campaign, did that count as volunteerism? Yes, as far as we were concerned. Did helping a friend organise a funeral, did that count as volunteering? Yes, as far as we were concerned. Now, did those kind of experiences end up being the centre of the book? Not so much. Because what the people generally, we were guided by what the interviewers themselves wanted to stress and focus on. And a lot of them wanted to talk about the home care or about the working needle exchange or working on the telephone lines within, say, an AIDS council. And so that's because that's what they focused on. I suppose we tended to focus on that. But I think we have a broader definition of volunteering than maybe is what is represented in the book. And of course there's formal volunteering and informal volunteering. And the government doesn't really know how to count all these things. Do you have to be with an official organisation, turning up at official time to do an official job as a volunteer? Or can you be doing a whole bunch of informal things, even looking after the neighbour's kids while you duck off, for an hour to go and do, something or other. So, it's a very broad definition. Do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I'd just echo what Paul said, that I think that, I'm looking around at some of the people who are in the book, people like Gay particularly, I think, sorry Gay, to put you on the spot, but yeah, I think it was, as you say, Paul, all-encompassing, and I think that it's really hard with particularly this kind of history to sort of draw that line and say this is when your volunteering stopped and this is when you were, kind of off duty. And I think maybe one of the things that this book can do is to kind of challenge that divide and say maybe what we think of as volunteering is a lot bigger than what you think, and really give due credit to the extraordinary work that these people did across so many different kinds of forms of labour.
Thanks, Shirley.
Brandon. Yes, Paul. Can we add a remark or two? the things that haven't been.
Oh look, Reg isn't looking at me, so I'll allow it. If you'd like to have a very brief closing remark before we wrap up, I'll allow it.
I'd like to say two things. The number one thing, first of all, if anyone who's in the room who was interviewed for the project, would you like to stand up? You don't have to have been in the book, but if you interviewed for the project, look at this. Fantastic. Thank you very much. And number two, we're living through a COVID pandemic at the moment, and we were writing the book as COVID hit, and that was a really strange experience. And in the early days of COVID, there was a lot of talk about volunteerism. Neighbours helping each other out, delivering meals for the elderly, this and that. And there was a lot of talk about it for about a week, and it seemed to happen for a little while, and then it seemed to stop being talked about, and then it seemed to have stopped happening. Because people got tired of doing it. It was hard. It was volunteer burnout with COVID. And I thought about this and I thought, well, geez, people in terms of AIDS volunteerism did it for 20 or 30 years. And they went back year after year after year. And isn't that amazing? So it's been fantastic to be able to celebrate that in the year of COVID, to write a book about that kind of volunteerism.
Shirlene, do you have any last remarks?
I'm really glad that Paul, I think the final word really should go to the people who volunteered. So if the book does anything, I hope that it elevates the stories of the people who did this remarkable work. And I think that, it was incredibly courageous of people to share their stories. We're really grateful. I hope that this helps broaden out Australian history. I hope this draws attention to a really remarkable contribution. And I really hope that we can remember what was a really difficult part of Australian history, but also really pay good tribute to people who did extraordinary things at a really hard time.
And I just want to know, did you actually get beyond the foreword?
It's a very interesting format, I think, where you can pick up in the middle. And I found myself reading particular chapters at different points and not going through the thing from the start to finish. But it's an emotional labour to read, I think, and to put it together, I think, would have been incredible. And it was, thank you for being authors and pulling me up on whether or not I read the homework before I came and did my book report. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to have a bit more housekeeping at the end, but there's a slight interim moment where Brent Mackey, who I believe is the Associate Director of Policy Strategy and Research at ACON, unless your job has changed since you were my boss, has a few brief words. I'll give you my mic. Thank you very much. Thank you.
No, I can stand. It's fine. I do need to read just a few brief words. So, as Brendan said, I'm Brent Mackey from ACON, Associate Director for Policy and Research and Strategy. I'd just like to say thank you to Shirlene, Paul and Robert for shining a light on this incredible contributions of volunteers. For organisations like ACON, like Positive Life, BGF, NAPWA and Albion Street, CSN, and so many others, volunteers are really our lifeblood. They are really what make us work. They are who we are as organisations. And I thank you for all the contributions of all the volunteers here today. And also as somebody who did volunteer back in the 1980s, I was part of CSN back then and also ACALI back then. And to the people who are in the room here today who have volunteered and who are interviewed in this book, I'm incredibly honoured and thankful for you today. So on behalf of all of us, I'd like to say thank you. And also thank you to our panellists today. I think we've got some gifts for you that are going to be brought out right now. Again, thank you. Thanks,
We did this at the start of the night, it would have been a much better show. Thank you again. Give a big round of applause to our panellists and speakers. So So just before we wrap up, and I go home and smash this bottle of whatever it is they've given me while I watch the finale of Handmaid's Tale, I would love to once again say thank you to the Bookshop Darlinghurst for organising tonight's event. Tony and the team from Soy 25 Restaurant and Bar, how amazing was literally everything tonight. A big thank you to partners ACON, City of Sydney and NewSouth Books. And also we'd like to say thank you to the ACON event staff who are Reg Domingo, Mark Dixon, sound engineer Alan, and a very special thank you to the birthday girl volunteer Maria, who is hiding somewhere. She is a powerhouse volunteer while we're talking about volunteering in these communities. Thank you again to all our panelists. They will be signing books, so buy the book, 10% discount on everything tonight. As I mentioned before, have it personalised. This concludes our evening. My name is Brandon Bett. It's been an absolute pleasure. I will see you all very soon at something, I'm sure. Have a lovely night.